Most people react to a serpent before they even consciously think about why. There's an instinctive reaction: fear, caution, discomfort. Even people who have never had a dangerous encounter with a snake will often respond to the image emotionally almost immediately. And yet, what's interesting is that the serpent has not only symbolized danger throughout history. In many traditions, it's also symbolized healing, transformation, wisdom, renewal, hidden knowledge, rebirth. Even modern medicine still carries the serpent symbolism in its imagery today. So, how can one symbol represent both fear and healing, danger and transformation, threat and wisdom? And maybe that question points towards something deeper about the way humans experience symbols altogether. Because humans do not only communicate through direct information, we communicate through images, stories, colors, objects, patterns, rituals, music, architecture, myth, and emotion. Meaning compressed into forms that people can recognize almost instantly. You're listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolism, and awareness. Not to predict, but to notice, and not to conclude, but to understand. Across thousands of years and vastly different cultures, humans have repeatedly returned to many of the same symbolic images: the serpent, fire, the eye, the spiral, the sun, the tree, the crown, the flood, the tower. And even when those symbols evolved or changed meanings over time, something about their emotional resonance often remained, which raises an interesting question. Why? Why do certain symbols continue reappearing across human history, spirituality, mythology, dreams, storytelling, religion, politics, and even modern internet culture? Why do humans attach so much meaning to symbols in the first place? And perhaps even more interestingly, why do symbols often affect us emotionally before we consciously analyze them? Because whether we realize it or not, humans are constantly interacting with symbols. National flags, religious imagery, wedding rings, brand logos, warning signs, emojis, internet memes, fashion, colors. Even the aesthetics people surround themselves with online often become symbolic expressions of identity, emotion, values, or belonging. And most of the time, we absorb these meanings automatically. Not because humans are irrational, but because symbolic thinking seems to be deeply woven into the way humans organize meaning itself. And maybe that's part of why symbols can feel strangely powerful during periods of uncertainty or transition. Because when humans are searching for meaning, symbols often become emotional anchors. Not always because the symbol itself contains some universal hidden truth, but because humans naturally search for patterns, relationships, memory, and meaning through symbolic language. And once you begin noticing how often humans communicate this way, it becomes difficult to stop seeing it everywhere. And maybe that's part of what makes symbols so powerful, is that they allow humans to compress enormous amounts of meaning into something simple. A single image, a single object, a single color, or a single gesture. And somehow entire emotional worlds can become attached to them. A wedding ring can represent love, commitment, memory, identity, grief, betrayal, belonging, or hope, depending on who's looking at it and what they've experienced. A national flag can create pride in one person and pain in another. A song can transport someone emotionally back into an entirely different season of their life within seconds. And what's interesting is that this symbolic way of organizing meaning appears almost everywhere that humans exist. In religion, in mythology, in dreams, in storytelling, in rituals, in art, in fashion, in politics, in internet culture. Even children naturally begin to understand symbols long before they fully understand abstract philosophy. Stories teach through symbols. Fairy tales teach through symbols. Myths teach through symbols. And often a symbol communicates emotionally much faster than direct explanation does, which may be part of why humans have repeatedly returned to symbolic storytelling throughout history. Not because symbols are memorable, but because they help organize experiences that are difficult to fully explain through direct language alone. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the archetypes and recurring symbols or symbolic imagery appearing across cultures, myths, religions, and dreams. Joseph Campbell explored similar ideas through mythological storytelling and recurring symbolic patterns within the hero's journey. And whether someone agrees fully with those theories or not, I do think it's interesting that humans across vastly different periods of history repeatedly return to many of the same symbolic forms. The serpent, the fire, the flood, the journey, the descent, the rebirth again and again. Not always with identical meanings, but often with recognizable emotional threads connecting them. And maybe that's because symbols are not only intellectual, they're emotional, experiential, relational. Sometimes symbols can become meaningful not only because of what they objectively are, but because what they awaken inside the people encountering them. And I think that's important because not every symbol carries meaning, and not every meaningful moment arrives loudly. Sometimes meaning emerges gradually through context, timing, emotion, memory, reflection. A symbol that feels meaningless in one season of life may suddenly feel emotionally significant in another. Not necessarily because the universe is forcing one rigid interpretation onto it, but because humans naturally interact with meaning relationally. And I think that's part of why symbols can feel especially powerful during periods of uncertainty, transition, grief, healing, or change. Because during those moments, humans often become more emotionally aware of patterns, connections, and resonance. Not always because every symbol is objectively a message, but because humans are meaning-making creatures trying to orient themselves inside uncertainty. And when you start looking at symbols this way, it becomes fascinating to notice how certain images continue reappearing across completely different cultures and periods of history. Take the serpent. For many people today, especially throughout much of the modern West, the serpent is often associated primarily with danger, deception, or fear. But historically, the symbolism was far more complicated than that. In some traditions, serpents represented healing, transformation, renewal, wisdom, cycles of rebirth. The shedding of skin alone became symbolic for transformation and renewal in many cultures. Even the medical symbol still used today traces back to serpent imagery connected to healing. And yet, at the same time, serpents also continued carrying associations with danger, temptation, unpredictability, or hidden power. Which is interesting because even as the interpretation shifted across cultures and time, something about the emotional resonance remained. The serpent continued representing transformation, thresholds, power, fear, change, and humans kept returning to it again and again. Fire functions similarly. Fire can symbolize destruction, but also warmth, life, civilization, spirit, transformation, purification, illumination. Humans gather around fire for survival, for ritual, for storytelling, for mourning, and for celebrations. And emotionally, people still respond to fire almost instinctively, even now. A candle in a dark room creates a completely different emotional atmosphere than fluorescent lighting. A campfire feels different than a screen. A burning structure feels different than a sunrise. The symbol shifts depending on the context, but the emotional power remains. And I think that that's part of what makes symbols so fascinating. Their meanings evolve. Cultures reinterpret them. Religions reinterpret them. Stories reinterpret them. But often, certain emotional through lines continue traveling underneath those changing interpretations across time. Not always identically and not universally, but recognizably. And maybe that's part of why symbols continue carrying so much influence even now. Because symbols often communicate emotionally before they communicate intellectually. We feel them before we fully analyze them. And once you begin noticing that, you start realizing humans have been speaking symbolically to each other for a very long time. And maybe that's where symbols become a little bit more complicated. Because symbols do not only influence people spiritually, emotionally, or culturally, they can also influence behavior, attention, identity, decision making. And humans have understood that for a long time. Religions understood it, governments understood it, advertisers understood it, corporations understood it, social media platforms understand it. Even physical environments are often designed symbolically and psychologically to shape human behavior in ways people may not fully consciously notice when they're inside them. Casinos are actually a really interesting example of this. Not because casinos are uniquely evil or manipulative, but because they make symbolic and environmental psychology extremely visible. Many casinos are intentionally designed to distort your sense of time. Few windows, few clocks, constant lighting, endless sound stimulation, bright visual reward cues, complex patterned carpets that subtly keep attention moving upward toward the machines and activity instead of downward for long periods of time. Whether every popular claim about casino psychology is fully accurate or not, casinos are well known for designing environments around behavioral influence. And what's fascinating is that most people walking through these environments are not consciously analyzing every symbolic or sensory cue while they're experiencing them. They're feeling them, responding to them emotionally, absorbing atmosphere. And I think that's important because humans are constantly existing inside symbolic environments, whether we realize it or not. Brand logos became associated with identity. Political imagery becomes associated with belonging. Internet aesthetics becomes associated with entire emotional world views. Algorithms begin reinforcing symbolic patterns through repetition. Even colors, music, architecture, clothing styles, or online visual language can begin subtly signaling values, identities, emotions, or group affiliation almost instantly. And once you begin noticing that, it becomes easier to understand why symbols can become so powerful collectively. Because symbols often spread emotionally faster than direct information does. People may not remember an entire speech, but they remember a flag, a slogan, an image, a symbol. And throughout history, symbols have repeatedly been used to unify people, inspire people, warn people, manipulate people, mobilize people, and sometimes divide people. Which means symbolic awareness also requires discernment, because humans do not only assign meaning to symbols individually, groups assign meaning collectively too. And sometimes those meanings create healing, connection, purpose, identity, or hope. But sometimes symbols can become emotionally charged in ways that fuel fear, hatred, tribalism, dehumanization, or unconscious conformity. And I think that's part of why symbolic awareness matters. Not so that people become paranoid and start believing that everything is secretly a sign, but so that people become more conscious of how meaning, emotion, and influence move through human environments all the time. Because once you start recognizing symbolic influence, you can also become more capable of stepping back and asking, why does this image affect me emotionally? What meaning have I attached to it? Where did that meaning come from? And is that meaning helping me become more aware or less aware? And I think this is where symbolic interpretation becomes personal. Because even though humans share many recurring symbols collectively, people also experience symbols individually, relationally, emotionally. The same image can mean completely different things depending on the moment someone encounters it, what's moving through, what memories have become attached to it, or what emotional state they're in when it appears. And I think that most people have had moments like this at some point in time in their lives. A song playing at exactly the right moment, a repeated image showing up during difficult season, a dream that stays emotionally vivid for years, an animal sighting that somehow feels strangely significant. Not necessarily because every moment contains some hidden supernatural message, but because humans naturally search for meaning through relationship, context, timing, memory, and emotional resonance. I had an experience like this years ago that stayed with me. Right before I found out that I was pregnant with my daughter, and while my son was in the hospital, a praying mantis landed on my car. What made it really strange was that it stayed there for an incredibly long time. I drove 35 miles on the highway, went 35 miles back, and it was still there. And somehow the praying mantis stayed that whole trip. Now, like I said, at the time, my older son had been in the hospital. So emotionally, I immediately interpreted the experience through that lens. I saw the praying mantis almost as a symbol of protection or reassurance surrounding his health and recovery. But then, 2 days later, I found out that I was pregnant with my daughter. And suddenly the meaning of that experience expanded. The symbol changed, or maybe more accurately, my relationship to it changed. What initially felt connected to fear and protection suddenly also became connected to transition, change, new life, and unfolding possibility. And I think experiences like that are part of why humans have always been drawn towards symbolic interpretation. Not necessarily because every symbol contains one fixed universal meaning, but because symbols often become emotionally woven into important moments of transition, uncertainty, memory, grief, healing, or transformation. Sometimes symbols help people reorganize emotional experiences that are difficult to fully explain logically. Sometimes they become anchors for reflection. Sometimes they simply help people pay closer attention to their own inner world. And I think there is actually something healthy about approaching symbolic interpretation gently instead of rigidly. Not every symbol is meaningful, and not every meaningful moment needs to become certainty. Sometimes reflection itself is the valuable part. The pause, the noticing, the awareness. The willingness to ask, why did this affect me emotionally? What does this connect to inside of me? What is happening in my life when this felt significant? Because I think there's a difference between symbolic awareness and symbolic obsession. One creates reflection. The other can create fear, hypervigilance, or the need to force certainty onto every experience. And personally, I don't think symbolic awareness is meant to disconnect people from reality. I think at its healthiest, it actually reconnects people more deeply to presence, to reflection, to emotional awareness, to intuition and meaning. Not as rigid answers, but as relationship. And maybe that's part of what makes symbols so enduring across human history. Because symbols do not only carry information, they carry emotion, memory, identity, fear, hope, belonging, meaning. And humans continue returning to them because humans themselves are symbolic creatures. We tell stories symbolically, we dream symbolically, we organize identity symbolically, we mourn symbolically, and we celebrate symbolically. Even the way people decorate their homes, choose clothing, build rituals, create art, or arrange sacred spaces often becomes an extension of symbolic expression. And maybe that's why symbols continue reappearing most strongly during moments of transition. Because when people are moving through uncertainty, grief, transformation, collapse, healing, or change, direct language alone often stops feeling sufficient. Symbols can help people emotionally orient themselves inside experiences that are difficult to fully explain rationally. Not because symbols replace reality, but because they help humans relate to reality emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, and collectively. And I think that's part of why symbolic awareness can actually become grounding when approached carefully. Because instead of moving unconsciously through emotional influence, collective messaging, fear, identity, or meaning making, people can begin noticing what they're participating in. What symbols emotionally activate them? What environments shape them? What narratives they're absorbing? What meanings they're reinforcing? And that awareness creates space. Not necessarily to reject symbolism, but to engage with it more consciously, more thoughtfully, more intentionally, because symbols themselves are not automatically good or bad. What matters is often the relationship humans build with them, the meanings they reinforce, the emotions they amplify, the behaviors they encourage, the awareness they cultivate. And maybe that's part of why symbols continue carrying so much power, even now in modern life, even in a world that often considers itself highly rational. Because humans never stopped being symbolic creatures. We simply changed the forms. Ancient civilizations carved symbols into temples. Modern humans place them into algorithms, branding, media, aesthetics, fashion, online identity, and digital culture. But the underlying process remains strangely familiar. Humans continue compressing emotion, meaning, identity, and worldview into symbolic forms that spread collectively across culture. And perhaps that's why symbols can sometimes feel strangely alive. Not necessarily because every symbol contains some hidden mystical force, but because symbols become woven into human emotion, memory, attention, belief, identity, and awareness. And once you begin noticing that, you realize symbols are not only something humans look at, they're something humans participate in. So, maybe the deeper question is not only what does this symbol mean? Maybe the deeper question is, what is this symbol awakening inside the people interacting with it? What emotions? What memories? What fears? What hopes? What identities? What behaviors? What awareness? And perhaps asking those questions gently, with curiosity instead of certainty, is part of what allows symbolic awareness to remain healthy. Not rigid, not paranoid, not obsessive, but reflective. Because maybe symbols are not only important for what they say about the world, but for what they reveal about the people interpreting them. But I'll leave that for you to think about. Thank you for being here with me and helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. Come back next week and we are going to talk about the tricksters. I'll see you there.